Welcome to Tulsa Community College's Remembering Greenwood project. I am Dr. Dwayne Dickens, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Tulsa Community College.
And I am Michael Singleton, Academic Success Coach, part of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Tulsa Community College.
We are pleased to come to you today as we highlight just a few areas of Greenwood. Our desire is that we preserve some of the experiences and research from our community.
And we also want to provide a great resource for ongoing discussion within classrooms, community conversations, and maybe even some family sharing time as we pass along the significant history to upcoming generations.
We note that this project is funded by Tulsa Community College, the Tulsa Community College Foundation, the Oklahoma Humanities, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And because of the many great, candid perspectives presented by those who are with us today, and views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this series do not necessarily represent those of TCC, the TCC Foundation, the Oklahoma Humanities, and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
We are so grateful for the scholars we have for this series. Shirley A. Nero, retired educator, past board member of the Oklahoma Historical Society, noted historian, and Oklahoma Black Towns tour guide. We have Dr. Vivian Clark Adams, retired Tulsa Community College educator, noted historian, and commissioner from the official Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot Massacre of 1921, along with Jimmy White, a retired educator from Connors State College, noted historian, and commissioner from the official Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot Massacre of 1921.
These scholars will guide us through various Greenwood histories that will shed light on some of the details while also raising some questions that will be helpful for deeper conversation about this historic place, Greenwood, within Tulsa that remains a place of many unknowns due to a history of silence that many have labeled a conspiracy of silence over these 100 years since the race massacre. And we must say, as we enter these discussions, that we are talking about the rich legacy of Greenwood since 1906, not just the 18-hour episode of shame between May 31st and June 1st that we know as the race massacre, or what some would call a race war or a pogrom. When we get to the end of the series, we will invite you to participate in a question and answer discussion.
For today, we will cover several areas regarding Greenwood, including how churches have been a steady influence within the Greenwood area with a specific focus on two churches, Vernon AME and Mount Zion Baptist Church.
Shirley Nero, and I'm from the historically all-Black town of Clearview, Oklahoma. The session is on how churches define culture within the Greenwood district. By 1906, the African-American area editors named Greenwood had a number by 1921, unusual African-American professionals had access to doctors, lawyers, ministers, 2 movie theaters, and a public library, 2 newspapers, but most of all, they had 13 churches and 3 fraternal lodges. Greenwood had become a mixture of African Americans and European Americans within their community. Well, let us focus on the Black church, the house of worship, and how it defined culture on Greenwood. For some, it was the ground zero for social justice. For others, it was a place of transcendent cultural gifts exported to the world, from the soulful voices of preachers and congregants to the sublime sounds of gospel music. For some, it was the most segregated hour of the week. But for the communities, church created individuals who became the sum hope, dreams, challenges, and obstacles that came their way in a positive, uplifting, and long-lasting manner. The Greenwood churches served as a positive change to inspired more change, a renewed hope, and a strength within their own self-sufficient boundaries. Churches work together at solving local issues involving local leaders, educating and training leaders, developing skills as they became to know each other, as they all worship together. The churches were also a world within a world where Black Americans could be themselves, an epicenter of freedom from struggle that revolutionized the United States across slavery and abolition, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Great Migrations. Now, currently, Dr. Robert Turner is the pastor of historic Vernon Chapel AME Church in Tulsa, in the Greenwood district, which is the only Ephesus that survived the 1921 race massacre on Greenwood. Let's hear him tell us about Greenwood and the Vernon Chapel AME Church.
Emancipation were created because they were segregated from white churches. They were in opposition to white teachings regarding African Americans, and some just
Hi, welcome to Historic Vernon African Methodist Episcopal Church, the grandmother of Greenwood. We've been here since 1905 and in this current location since 1908. We have withstood the test of time through the tornadoes, through the terrible 1921 race massacre, through urban renewal, or we call urban removal, through the building of the interstate highway. We have stood the test of time and remain here in this very spot. We are the remnant of Black Wall Street. Our membership just turned over 115 years of age now, and our Faith Hall was built in 1959 under the administration of Reverend Ben Hill, who was also the first Black elected to the state legislature in Oklahoma. It was the site of the first Head Start here in Tulsa, the only site in Tulsa outside of a jail or hospital that's been open every day since COVID-19. We have, by God's grace, been able to provide over 260,000 meals to people in our community. This sanctuary that I'm standing in right now was built by the survivors of the 1921 race massacre. Everything here, even the ground that we're standing on, was built by the survivors. Our basement that we have right underneath the sanctuary is the only thing on Greenwood Ave that survived the race massacre that we still have today. When I say our basement is the only thing left standing on Greenwood, this picture puts that into context. This picture also shows the devastation by fire that occurred right here at this church. One may ask, why didn't the fire spread? Well, we have the reason why the fire did not spread, and which would allow people to hide in this basement. So when I told you earlier about why the fire didn't spread, it's because this obviously was before air conditioning. This wall went from here all the way over to there. And so the fire on this side of the wall then spread to over here. It is the refuge room is what we call it, where people sought refuge from the massacre. And in 2003, because the city of Tulsa knew the history of this church, they wanted to buy it. We were gonna build this church with the money. We never took the offer because it was insulting, but we keep this picture because it was a sign of when they were trying to further gentrify the area. Right now, we're the only Black-owned entity on the original Greenwood Avenue. This is what happens when concrete or metal burns, it buckles. And in 1995, when we did renovation to the basement, they just painted over it. Because oftentimes when you have a difficult event that happens in your life, either you choose to prosecute or fight, or you choose to forget about it. And a lot of us, to handle that trauma, we just chose to paint over it and try to forget about it. But the scars are still there. This picture right here shows one of our survivors that was a member of this church, Robert Fairchild. He was a survivor, and this is a bio that he wrote about himself. In his bio, nowhere does it mention he was a survivor of the race massacre, because to him and to men of that generation, they still suffered trauma from it. They never saw justice. This picture shows the namesake of Vernon, Dr. William Tecumseh Vernon. He became the first Black Register of Treasury appointed by President Theodore Roosevelt. I always tell people, don't take my word for it. This cornerstone that was placed here in 1954 came off of the church that was here in 1908. This cornerstone was laid by survivors of the race massacre. Vernon was like the church for Greenwood. We had members such as H.A. Guest, who was the first black attorney here in Tulsa. R.T. Bridgewater, who was the first black physician here in Tulsa. E.W. Vaden, who owned a business with his wife right at the corner of Greenwood and Archer. We had members such as Ellis Walker Woods, who was the first black principal here, founding principal of Booker T. We had some powerful, well-established individuals who were members of this church. Okay, and so during the massacre, they killed, bombed, looted, and then they took the bodies of the people that they killed and dumped them into mass graves. Those folk who were able to survive were sent to concentration camps, and they sent the men and women to different concentration camps all throughout the city of Tulsa. The men ended up getting out roughly around 2, maybe 3 months later, and we have proof that one of the first places the men of this church came after the race massacre of 1921 was right here to this church. These black men who didn't wait for anybody else's help, who didn't plead and beg with anybody for help, came out on their own and rebuilt this church. All right, so these chairs are the original chairs of our basement. Remember, sat in as we were waiting for the sanctuary to be built. Survivors sat in these very chairs. We have actually 36 of them left, and we have pictures to verify the age of these chairs, dating back to 1957 even, with these young ladies and men who are now great-grandparents sitting in these chairs. Now you see our marquee light. This light was built in 1949 during a time when the city of Tulsa refused to put any public dollars in the black community. So the members of our church got tired of pleading with the city of Tulsa and said, you know what, forget it. We'll build our own light. And they put this marquee light up, which is now the oldest marquee light in Tulsa. And we're the only church with a marquee light. To me, this place is the most historic spot in Tulsa, definitely one of the most historic places in Oklahoma. And if you have not come, please, sir, and please, ma'am, come by. We'd love to have you. If you are not comfortable coming out, we do live stream service because there is a limit on how many can come inside our sanctuary due to COVID-19 restrictions. But we offer live stream opportunity on our website at vernoname.com, and we would love to have you. God bless you.
Hello, I'm Vivian Clark Adams. I'm going to talk about how Black church burnings are a form of terrorism. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences such as those of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. This definition, FBI definition, definitely accurately describes the terrorism against Black churches as evidenced in church burnings. So why were Black churches targeted by white terrorist groups? A number of reasons. A little history is that early on, any Black associations or slave associations were viewed as a suspect and as dangerous to white slave owners. And slaves did try to get together for religious services. Most of the time they were supervised. Any unsupervised were very much suspect, and the slave owners tried to prevent that for fear that the slaves might be plotting something against them. Others were more in favor of it because it taught, religious principles taught obedience to their masters. After emancipation, some of the emphases of the Black church changed a little bit from just deliverance from slavery to the many acts of violence and degradation and restrictions, Jim Crow restrictions that they had to deal with. And they became a center, the Black church became a center for dealing with the needs of its members. Many more Black churches were created after emancipation and were there to to expand the number of denominational or religious offerings for Black Americans. The Black church performed many functions. As Ms. Nero mentioned, the church was almost an all in all. It performed spiritual nourishment, weddings, baptisms, funerals, burials, education, medical help, childcare, leadership training and opportunities, legal help, social, political, economic opportunities, emotional and financial support, motivation, empowerment, mobilization, freedom and respect within its walls, and freedom from oppression and racism. The Black church was the soul of the Black community. And therefore, being so important in the Black community, the terrorist acts against the Black church, the burnings, were particularly effective because they sent the message not only to powerful Black leaders within the community, and many of these were religious leaders, but also to just about every member of the community. When you destroy the soul, you, in many cases, tend to destroy the motivation, the hope, and instill fear in the entire community. So that's what they were intended for. Black church burnings have been occurring since Black churches have been in existence all across the country. In recent years, from 1995 to 1999, 145 Black churches were burned. In that time, 1996, the Church Arson Prevention Act was passed. In 2015, 7 Black churches were burned in 10 days. In 2020, February 2020, a 22-year-old white man set fires to 3 Black churches in Louisiana over a 10-day period, excuse me. Today, there is a debate over the effectiveness of the Black church, but those of us who are in the religious community, we do understand the Black church is still very powerful and important in the Black community. One current example is Georgia Bishop Reginald Thomas Jackson, who is presiding prelate of the 6th Episcopal District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And this includes 500 churches across Georgia. This immense church network is taking a stand against the voter suppression bill of HB 531. An historic example, church burning, is Mount Zion Black Baptist Church. It was burned during the Tulsa race riot massacre. And like the legendary Phoenix, it did rise from its ashes. Reverend or Dr. Charlene Johnson, who is president of the board, tells the history of the majestic and resilient Mount Zion Baptist Church.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Charlene Johnson. I am the chairman of the board of Mount Zion Baptist Church, and I would like to welcome you to Mount Zion. From 1909 to 1921, Mount Zion moved several times to different areas, different churches, one building that was called the Tabernacle, and that tabernacle was built adjacent to the building that we are standing in today, before the race riot. In June 1st of 1921, the Greenwood massacre occurred. White rioters believed that Mount Zion was holding guns and ammunition in the church. Therefore, the church was burned and bombed, along with several other acres of the Greenwood area. During that time, Reverend Whitaker, who was the minister of the church at that time, called the city officials to the church after the riot to show them that Mount Zion had nothing to do with the race riot and that we did not have guns and ammunition in the church. After that time, this church was built with a $92,000 cost at the time. $50,000 was in a mortgage. Some of the members decided that that was not a just mortgage because of the riot. As we went to the insurance company to pay off that mortgage, the insurance company said because it was a riot that the insurance would not be valid. Some of the members decided that it was a just debt and that they would pay that debt off. which did split the church. So we lost a lot of members during that time. So from 1921 until 1937, the debt was paid off. In 1937, Reverend Whitaker held services in the basement, which is what we call J.H. Dotson Hall now. The services were held in the basement of the church. It was just a dirt floor at that time, and services were held in the basement of this church until 1952, actually, when the new church that we're standing in now was finally constructed. The stained glass windows were ordered and shipped in this edifice from Germany in 1952. The historical designation of the church was given to us in 2009 by the state of Oklahoma, and then in August of 2009 by the National Historical Registry for the rebuilding efforts of Mount Zion in the Greenwood community. We would love for you to come by and visit the church, see the historical significance of rebuilding in a community that was destroyed by the riots in 1921, and see how this community is continuing to grow. You can contact us at our website, which is mountzionbc.org, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at any time to find out any more information that you may need. But please come by, contact us. We would love to have you here.
Post-war America was a time of great upheaval. Blacks and whites of the South moved west for a new start. The slaveholding tribes that had been defeated and portions of their land taken away by the federal government as punishment for their war against them. Many all-Black towns had been established prior to the war, but April 22nd, 1889, Indian Territory was open to settlement, and soon there would be over 50 all-Black towns established in the territories of Oklahoma and Indian Territory. The most famous of these all-Black towns were Langston and Bowling. However, there were large Black communities within the most populous cities of the state: Guthrie, Muskogee, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa. Blacks came for a new life, but many Southern whites came with their old ways of segregation. December 24th, 1865, in Pulaski, Tennessee, former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest helped form the Ku Klux Klan and soon became its first Grand Wizard in order to keep Blacks in their place. Because of the actions of the federal government to suppress this terrorist organization, the Klan had been defunct until the movie Birth of a Nation revived interest in it. William J. Simmons led the second resurgence of the Klan in the 1920s. The newly formed state of Oklahoma proved to be fertile soil for the growth of this reborn terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan. And by 1919, the Klan was so strong that they paraded in Skiatook. And by 1921, Tulsa had over 2,000 Klansmen as members. Their preferred method of keeping Blacks in their place was through lynching. Between 1885 and 1930, 147 lynchings were reported and many more unreported. Of that number, 50 of the victims were Black. And between the Red Summer of 1919 and 1920, 6 Blacks were lynched in Oklahoma. The most infamous murder by lynching in Oklahoma was that of Laura and L.D. Nelson, mother and son, who were lynched May 25th, 1911, and hung from a bridge over the North Canadian River near Okemah, Oklahoma. Blacks in all the all-Black towns that surrounded Tulsa became alarmed and very concerned about their relatives and friends who resided in the Greenwood area of Tulsa, when, through the newspapers and word of mouth, racial tensions were increasing as a result of the threatened lynching of Dick Rowland. These Blacks were preparing to come to the aid of their fellow Black men and women and children in Tulsa, and this was being a call made by the African Blood Brotherhood and other organizations in the state.
Black towns and how prosperous they used to be. We do need to talk about the demise of the Black towns. What caused this demise? And I won't say demise. We still have some Black towns that are functioning, that are still a part of Oklahoma. But we had so many. We at one time, Oklahoma, I believe, had more Black towns than any other state. And of course, Ed McCabe and others tried to make Oklahoma into a Black state. So what happened that we don't have as much Black representation, as many Black towns as we used to have?
The factor that our town building ceased to be was that it was such a big amount of, or a big effort in the whites in the area, is that they did not want to see the towns prosper anymore. There was between 1902 and 1911, there was such a big effort, a great effort in the town building, and the whites did not want to see the prosperity of the towns. And so there was a great effort that they actually had agreements between themselves that they would not sell land to any Black farmer or lease any land to any Black farmer, particularly here in Offusky County. So there were those efforts, that agreements that were drawn up between each of the landowners that had land, that they would cease to sell land or lease land out. And so there were scare tactics, such as the Laura Nelson, the hanging of her and her son. So those were scare tactics, segregation, the Jim Crow laws, all of those things began to rise up and frighten the Blacks to stay in their own place. So that was a effort to cease the building of towns after 1911. Now, Jimmy, you may want to add some more, since there's something that you were saying.
Yes, the all-Black town movement, or the Exodusters, Blacks in the post-Civil War period were being horribly treated. As I said, lynching is the preferred method of the white supremacists to keep Blacks in their so-called places. And many Blacks believed that if they could move west, where the land was free, it was brand new, some of these old antiquated ideas could be left behind. However, when Indian Territory was opened up to settlement and Southern whites moved in, they brought their ideas. And so the all-Black towns prospered because of segregation to a degree, because they had to rely on themselves to produce everything that they needed. And so Black farmers became very prosperous. In his book, Rope and Faggot, Walter White of the NAACP investigated many of the lynchings and discovered that in almost every case, they used some criminal activity of rape or stealing to justify the lynching, but the true cause was prosperity, jealousy for the Black farmers becoming more prosperous than their counterparts. And in order to keep them in their place, to oppress them, they used these terror tactics of lynching Therefore, in Oklahoma, we're going to see, as I said earlier, several lynchings occur in Oklahoma. And then the summer of 1919, after the Great War, to make the world safe for democracy had been successfully fought, and Black veterans come back, they're demanding their rights that they gained for the Europeans. And once again, we're going to see white supremacists try to hold these Black men down through night riding terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. And so the Black towns were quite prosperous, and the Black communities, such as Greenwood, were also quite prosperous because Blacks had to rely upon themselves for their survival.
I think we see the most disruptions in terms of riots, in terms of lynchings and anything else regarding Black towns and Black areas when they are prosperous. There is the jealousy and the hatred and the desire not to see a Black prosperity. I think it's been a dilemma for white Americans for a long time to preach the inferiority of Blacks, but when they see Blacks succeed and succeed extremely well, then there's the intention of putting obstacles in the way to make sure that even though they're inferior, they don't succeed. When you mentioned the World War I veterans, my dad was a World War II and Korea veteran, and he showed me areas and military documents that talked about the inferiority of Black soldiers, but at the same time, to make sure that they did not succeed, they put many, many obstacles in the way, just in case they might succeed.
Very successful as in Oklahoma is that Blacks had a combined amount of acreage, more than any other state in the United States, with their combined amount of acreage total more than all the combined land owned in the United States. So that just tells you how prosperous. And many of the Blacks owned land that was underneath them in mineral rights, minerals, oil, gas, and that was something else that the whites wanted, was their land, because if they had the mineral rights to their properties. And that was something else that was very successful. Some of them became very wealthy because of their mineral rights. And that was another cause of them taking away or gaining part of the Blacks' lands. And plus, they're also in the Oklahoma Territory. Many of the Blacks were in the land runs and had gained much land in that area, in Oklahoma Territory, and of course the freedmen that gained land from the Indian tribes.
As Dr. Clark had said, the whites were trying to paint Black people as being inferior and incapable. However, in Oklahoma, these all Black towns proved quite the opposite. Mrs. Nero's hometown of Clearview, the Blacks there established a college and other businesses, not just farming, but other businesses. My hometown is of Langston is known for its university system. There were banks established in towns like Boley. In fact, Boley is quite well known for the Pretty Boy Floyd gang trying to rob the bank, because they knew that those Black farmers had money in that community. And so what we call soda pop bottling companies, movie theaters, hotels, restaurants, all of these businesses. And then within a Black community like Greenwood, all of these entrepreneurial skills came together to the point that Booker T. Washington, who was leading this movement of self-help through business, came to the Greenwood area and declared it to be the Black Wall Street of the United States. And there were jealous eyes that looked across those railroad tracks and wanted to suppress the Black businesses and self-reliance that they saw growing.
We thank you for joining us today, and please look for other events at Tulsa Community College as we engage with our community in discussions such as this one.
We give special thanks to our scholars, Shirley A. Nero, Dr. Vivian Clark Adams, and Jimmy White. We also thank our funders, Tulsa Community College, the Tulsa Community College Foundation, the Oklahoma Humanities, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And certainly, we thank each of you. Please share the knowledge and join us at Tulsa Community College. You belong here. So we're going to turn things over to our scholars, our humanities scholars for today. So that will be Shirley and Nero, as well as Dr. Vivian Clark Adams and Jimmy White. So we'll just listen to a few statements from them and then start preparing any additional questions that you have, especially related to their comments.
I always forget to unmute myself. Just to start the discussion, I'm going to go back to something that was said yesterday just to provide some clarification and understanding that there are many different views about things. I was going to comment on something Mark Carlson said. He did a great job in his presentation, but he mentioned that that the Home Guard came to Greenwood around midnight and disarmed Blacks and took them away so that there was nobody available to fight for Greenwood. Well, that's not the information we got on the Race Riot Commission. Our information was that the individuals in the Greenwood community basically had repelled the white invaders. And around between 12 and 2, around that time, people didn't hear a lot of the fighting, a lot of the violence. They didn't think that there was anything else going on. If you remember in Mary Parrish's book, she mentioned that she went to bed because they thought everything was over. And many people thought that it was over, and so they felt that they could safely go to bed that night. But we all know about the infamous 5 o'clock whistle that mobilized the white mob to come into town. But there was that period, lull period, where people thought things had settled down. I do want to mention two things with that. One, that our information from the Tulsa Race Riot Commission was that the National Guard didn't come until later that morning, until about 9 o'clock that morning. So different, viewpoints, different accounts there. The other thing I want to mention is that we need to understand that the Black community fought valiantly against the white invaders. And that's why there is a debate about whether we should call it a massacre or we should call it a riot or a war. People think that war, that some people think that war is an appropriate term because this is the only race riot in which they used airplanes and explosives and machine guns. But we don't want people to believe that the Black community was initially overrun and nobody could, everybody was hurt or killed and nobody fought back. We fought back very valiantly, especially the World War I veterans. There is information from the African Blood Brotherhood and their magazine, The Crusader. Also, Smitherman wrote a poem about the fact that actually we repelled the invaders initially. And there, you can look at it as two battles. The first battle was won by the Black community. And then the second battle, we were overrun by an enormous mob of between 5,000 and 10,000 people. Any comments, Jimmy or Shirley? Hey, Shirley, I think you're
Okay,
still on mute.
Yeah, they finally let me unmute, and I just want to piggyback on yours. Is that Jim and I were on the Oklahoma Historical Society annual conference today, and there was a professor named Randy Hopkins, and some of you may have heard of him, that he has done extensive research also and has written a very fine paper. And I encourage all of you to maybe look him up. His name is Randy Hopkins, and he has a website out called centerforpublicsecrets.org. And he has presented the paper today and on Smitherman and about the Tulsa race riot before starting in 1918. And he goes one day after the Tulsa race massacre. So if you would look him up, and he's also written in the Oklahoma Chronicles in the winter edition of 2019 to 2020 about the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and the outrage of 1917. And he takes us from 1918 through 1921 in the Tulsa Race Massacre. And he also mentioned about the whistle. So that is something that he is, I think, actually proven that did occur. And he talks about the Home Guard extensively and how they came to be. So this is something that we all need to look at his work. And also he talks about the pioneer judge, the life of Robert Williams. And Jim and I, and Jimmy wants to comment some more about what was said on that presentation. Is something that we all need to look into and would add extensively to our research on the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yes, we during the commission, we investigated the opening events of the Tulsa Race War. And one of the controversial elements was that Black oral tradition said that a signal was given to alert the white invaders to come into the Greenwood area. And his research indicated that in 1919, the Council of Defense had organized a method in which the citizens of Tulsa could be alerted to a attack on the city through a siren. And so that definitely indicates that these people were quite aware. They had practiced this before, that a signal would be given at dawn and that they would invade Greenwood and start burning and looting and killing Black people in wholesale. Another aspect that I want to talk about is the Black church. And so we saw two prominent churches that are survivors still to this day in Tulsa. And one of the points is that the Black church was the center of the Black community. And so it was through the churches that leadership was developed. Many of you know that in Sunday school, they began teaching the very youngest Black children to speak up loudly, pronounce your words correctly, to be fearless in your presentation of ideas to other people. And so through the Black churches, we see people like the Reverend Martin Luther King develop his skills of leadership. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it would seem odd that Christians, so-called Christians, would go into a community and target Black churches to destroy. But if you understand that the power of the Black community was in the churches, then you can see why Vernon and Mount Zion were destroyed. And so this mob was intent on cutting the heart out of the Black community so that it could not come back.
We're getting some questions on chat about a couple of things that we might want to respond to. One is, again, whether or not the appropriate designation is riot, massacre, or war. The official designation now is massacre. But I mentioned briefly why some of us believe war is more appropriate. First of all, to indicate again that the Black residents fought valiantly, fought back the initial white mob and actually won the first battle there. And the fact again that elements of war, machine guns and bombs were used on the Greenwood community, and that had not happened in any other race riot. So for some of us, we would prefer the term war. Any other comments on that?
Yes, the use of airplanes, machine guns, plus the Great War, which is now known as the First World War. These veterans were trained in these military tactics, and they employed these military tactics and military weapons to invade Greenwood, and the Black veterans used them to defend Greenwood. That is not a riot. That is clearly a war to me. And as I said, the first battles of the war were won by the Black defenders, and then eventually the war was lost by overwhelming numbers of invaders, and Greenwood was destroyed. So I prefer the term race war, not race massacre.
There's another question regarding the number of dead, which is a question we may never be able to answer because most of the victims were not accorded the dignity of a burial, mass burial or any kind of burial. We talked about the fact that there are eyewitness accounts of railroad cars full of Blacks being shipped out of, or victims being shipped out of town. There are accounts of victims being thrown in the river. One personal experience for me when I worked for the Tulsa Health Department for a while, one of my co-workers came to me and asked, he said, "Are you on the Race Riot Commission?" And I said, "Yes." And he made the statement, he said, his grandfather, who was deceased at the time, he said, but he told the story to his wife, and it passed down through the generations that his grandfather, who was a medical student at the University of Oklahoma, mentioned the fact that there was always a scarcity of cadavers until after the Tulsa race riot. So there is evidence that the bodies were shipped all over the place. While I was on the commission, Eddie Faye Gates and I used to talk a lot about this. We would get anonymous calls, and I remember 2 calls in particular. They said, "You need to look under the Sears parking lot at 21st and Yale." They talked about looking under various underpasses. The oral history was that the bodies were all over. They were disposed of wherever they could be disposed of. Oh, let me mention one other thing too, in terms of the numbers. Again, we will never know, but the African Blood Brotherhood, again, was here in Tulsa. I think they had a local chapter, but others came into town. The African Blood Brotherhood was a protective organization, and it went to many cities across the country to help when there was rioting, to help the Black citizens. In their magazine, which is called The Crusader, the June 1921 issue, they talk about the Tulsa race riot. They were blamed for inciting, and of course that was not the case. But one thing they talk about is the fact that the local authorities would not admit the numbers of whites that were killed. we mentioned the first battle actually was won by the Black residents of Greenwood, because they were able to repel the group of whites that came into the community. And the African Blood Brotherhood magazine talks about the large number of whites that were killed, the fact that in some cases their faces were painted black, so you couldn't tell that these were whites that were killed, and that they were buried and shipped off by night. So again, you couldn't see the number of, or you wouldn't be able to understand the large number of white fatalities. Anybody want to piggyback on that? Shirley, were you going to say something?
No, I didn't. I was just wondering what other questions that the audience may have that I can't see the questions. I'm on a cell phone, so I don't know what else is being asked.
Okay, I got some interesting things here. The term, and thank you, Chief, you mentioned that it should be just city-sanctioned murder. There are some comments about the whites actually did riot, and I don't see all of them at all the questions at the same time. One is saying because of, this is Alicia Latimer, because of predispositions to assume when the term riot is used, to assume that the African Americans were at fault. The term riot is not the best way to describe what happened, and also riot terminology allowed insurance companies not to pay claims. That's a very good point. The insurance companies would not pay the riot claims because they had the exception of the riot that this would they would not pay claims if it was a riot. I'm looking for other questions here. If you guys
just on that point too, during the commission, we discovered that the insurance companies picked who they would not pay claims for, and so the churches, the Black churches, and the Black claims were denied, but the for example, the Redfern case, where the sporting goods owners, store owners, they were able to get reparations for their claims made because of the invaders breaking into their stores and stealing weapons and ammunition. They were repaid, but all the Black claims were denied.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to look at, let's see.
There is one question in the room that it's more forward looking. What is our role as people who live in Tulsa, in the United States and the world, to be involved and to learn and create awareness regarding the 1921 race massacre in a looking ahead perspective?
Well, we certainly have to keep it. We must never let this this event be relegated to silence again. My concern is that there are all kinds of commemorations about Greenwood, and Greenwood was, the epitome of Black success, business success. But we can never forget the fact that, again, these were people behind Greenwood. These were extraordinary people who built Greenwood. And we must not forget that, and the fact that they were victims. We will never, I believe, achieve justice until we achieve justice for the survivors, which I found out there are only 3, and then their descendants. On the original lawsuit filed by Johnny Cochran and Charles Ogletree and the other lawyers, there were over 300 descendants listed on that suit. We must never forget about them. It is a matter of justice. The United States has paid every group under the sun, but African Americans. The Oklahoma and the state of Oklahoma and the city of Tulsa are culpable in this. And there needs to be some reparations, some payments to these individuals who lost everything and were not allowed to pass down generational wealth. We must let, I'll just say this right after the commission disbanded, there were international groups that came through Tulsa, and sometimes some of us would be asked to speak with them, and they were under the impression that Tulsa did everything right. And Tulsa made a start in terms, and Oklahoma made a start in terms of organizing the commission to study what happened during that time. But again, they have not done everything right until they compensate the victims for their losses. These people lost things only because of the color of their skin and because of their prosperity. Rosewood, Florida, paid compensation for the victims of the race riot there. There is a city in Illinois now that is organizing ways in which they can pay slavery reparations to their residents. So if there wasn't a precedent set that other groups who have been wronged, who have been victimized, if we didn't have that precedent that they had been paid, then we wouldn't have a case. But we do have that case, and it looks to me like, you know, racism is the primary reason why somehow we cannot compensate Black victims.
Another phenomenon that is interesting to me is that nearly a year ago, a multicultural group of people, in response to George Floyd's murder, had civil unrest in Tulsa. And so the question is, was that a protest or was it a riot? And so you can see how difficult that is to determine today, because the people who were on the side of justice for George Floyd said it was a protest, which is protected by the First Amendment, and the people on the side of disorder by government means called it a riot. And Oklahoma just recently became one of the few states in the entire nation to pass a law saying that it's legal now, well, will be in November, it'll be legal that if it is a riot and you're in a vehicle, you fear that your lives are in danger, that you can use your vehicle to murder protesters. And so you talk about today, and I haven't seen very much protest about this new law that the state of Oklahoma has just recently signed, and it will go into effect. And so here we are today. We have the example of the 1921 race war, and we're in the 21st century now, and still this state is passing laws that will curtail the activity of people who say that there is something wrong and we want to try to right it.
Or protest.
Yeah, we as a community, we don't have the actually the luxury of sitting back and watching things. You know, those of us who are my age, I would like to pass the baton to the younger people to pick up the protesting, to become more active in the fight. The fact of the matter is, even though things are changing somewhat, the murder verdicts against Chevin may be hopeful, but our fight is far from over in terms of Black equality and Black justice. So part of what we're going to do as residents of Tulsa, part of what we need to do is continue fighting for these things that we're facing, and it does mean writing our our legislators, our council people. It may involve writing letters or whatever. We've got to keep it in the forefront. And if enough of us continue the fight, then somebody's going to pay attention. At one time, I heard that if a legislator receives like 7 calls or 7 letters, they think the world is ending and they will act because we have become a society that is not as involved anymore. So we have to get involved. We have to, as soon as we hear about things like that legislation you were talking about, Jimmy, we got to protest right then and say, no. And as we mentioned yesterday, as someone had mentioned that, we sat by and now Greenwood has been redistricted into downtown instead of North Tulsa, where because of tourism and other things, we possibly could and get more tax dollars to help the community and also eventually to help the race riot survivors and descendants.
And may I insert just a little information here? I did want to, I've seen several chat sessions or postings related to the churches. And so, of course, Mount Zion identifies as they were the only living structure or only structure that remains. So that, of course, the other churches, I'm sure we'll have some research stated about that, but I did want to point us to this monument that we do have in front of the Mabel Little House at the Greenwood Cultural Center, just to let us see some of the locations and businesses that were identified as destroyed. Now, destroyed does not mean that the basement financially destroyed, but maybe there were parts of the building that still were intact, where they could have had church, where they could have at least done something, whether it was safe or not. So we can see the school, Dunbar School there. You can see different locations that are listed. I did want to particularly, since we've seen several posts about Mount Paradise Baptist Church, did want to point out there that it's listed as being destroyed. But of course, you look at the same, you can see that Vernon AME was listed as destroyed as well. So again, for finance, just like when we have a destruction of a car, some people can have it rebuilt and some people will still sit in the car, although the insurance company will consider it destroyed. Another item I wanted to point out here is, as soon as I can find my screen, we do have other, I wanted to go back to Booker T. Washington. So there was a point made about Booker T. Washington and whether it was elementary school or Booker T. Washington High School. And I did have a picture here that I just wanted to put up there. This is the monument that is in front of OSU Tulsa. Now, again, we can compare this to other historical records that may have called it elementary school or high school, but this is the one. And of course, it's documenting what one source says, and it may not necessarily line up with another source. So if we're talking about this actual monument, it says in 1913, the school was established, but when you read into it, it is also indicating it was a 4-room wooden structure and eventually was built and built to be larger until it was Booker T. Washington High School. The iteration of the names is not indicated on this placard here, this marble monument. So I just wanted to put that in there for us to address something that we said yesterday. The conversation is great, so I do want to point that out. What we want to do is get more conversation, compare the information. And so I really want to thank the scholars for today, Dr. Adams, Ms. Nero, and Mr. Jimmy White. They have done an outstanding job of preparing in terms of for this moment. And if you have any last remarks, we're just going to, it is 2:06. So if you take maybe a minute to close us out, and then we are going to let people go for today. And we look forward to tomorrow, where we will talk about additional issues, including how centers are preserving the history. So if you just close us out, we will be about the rest of our day.
Well, okay. For me, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. And if we see some questions that have been posted that were not answered, then we will we'll address those tomorrow. And I appreciate everyone for joining in. And hopefully you enjoyed the presentation today. And again, we're waiting to see you again tomorrow. We appreciate your attendance.
I'd like to also say thank you for being a part of this, and the dialogue has been great. I still haven't seen all the questions. I'm still trying to learn how to navigate the chat screen, but some very good questions and very good comments. And this type of dialogue, it's never a one-way dialogue. We learn from everybody. And we need to keep that dialogue going. And I really like the question about what are we going to be doing as residents of Tulsa. We need to continue to be a part of what's happening and monitor the situation and be a part of changing things that are not good for the Greenwood and North Tulsa communities.
I also want to thank everybody for giving us this opportunity to talk about our past. But the main point is that what good is knowledge of the past if we don't apply it to living today? And that's the reason I brought up that we have a situation now where things are being done that are regressive in the state of Oklahoma right now, but we are armed with the knowledge of the past of what can happen if this regression continues. And so we need to become active when we see something is wrong.